Genesis 17, 1 through 27. Just as a reminder, for this portion, we are not reading the whole chapter. We're just going to jump straight into it and use the story arcs to help us break down the story. So, verse 1, when Abram was 99 years old. Now, let me just stop right there. We got this marker right here of time, right? I should be using blue. And we don't have Genesis 16 here. Let's see if I've got it. Yep, Genesis 16. All right. And if we go all the way down to the bottom of Genesis 16, we'll see that Abram was 86 years old in the previous verse. Like verse 16, that's how old he is. And now, here in the next chapter, he's 99. So we've got 13 years that have transpired between verse 1 of chapter 17 and the end of 16. 13 years of silence, at least from our part of the story. Maybe Abram's gone through things, but I think that that's important. Now we know that Ishmael's 13 years of age. It's been 13 years, and we don't know what's going on in those years, and I think that's on purpose. So after 13 years of living with Ishmael, of having Ishmael as a son, then the Lord appeared to him and said, I am God Almighty. Here we go, some commands now. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then, meaning what's about to come is conditional on these two things. Then I will make my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers. This is a big deal because, and previously, there had been no conditions on the covenant. God had just said, I'm going to just do this. And now God says, walk before me faithfully and blamelessly. And we might be asking why. And what's really interesting is that God begins to use this word walk. If you guys remember in Genesis chapter 15, Abram had faith and he was justified, right? Now, faith looks like something, it acts like something, it moves and it breathes and it causes us to do things. And so what we're learning here, remember that this is written to or written for the Israelites from Moses, from the Lord, that when we have faith in God, it should cause us to behave a certain way. And God is teaching that to Abram here and now at 99 years of age. Walk before me and be faithful and blameless. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Faithfully here is more than just walking by faith. It has to do with conduct. It's talking about live this blameless, this righteous life. Faith is going to produce then this behavior that pleases the Lord. And what God wants is for us to be like him. He wants us to be holy. And then it says, then I'll make my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers. And we're just kind of wrestling through this. Wait, does this mean that God's blessing is contingent upon our action? Is that what this is saying? And the answer is yes for Abram. And it was also yes for Israel. And what we see is that they break the covenants. Particularly Israel breaks the covenants. Abram does not. But this other addition here, greatly increase your numbers. As we're going to see through this, Abram's going to become the father not of one nation, but of many nations. He has a second wife later in life by the name of Keturah. And through Keturah, he begets, I think, 5 or 6 more different people groups beyond the Israelites. So there's this kind of increasing of the covenant, and there is a condition put on Abram's behavior. So if we're going to go all the way back down to our opening kind of timeline here. Let's wait for that to load. Come on, timeline. There we go. So we'll start off here at the beginning with verses 1 through 2. And God gives Abram a command, right? And let's not forget that 13 years go by. This is new, this giving a command. And as we'll see in the progression of this arc, there is going to be a testing of faith. In fact, if we could zoom out on Abram's life, beginning here in chapter 17 and going all the way up to chapter 22, this whole thing is a progressive testing of Abram's faith. And I would just encourage you to see these chapters that way. So anyways, we're going to get like, if you could do the whole thing, it would look like these little arcs going all the way up. And, chapter 17 will be one, and then chapter 21 will be another, and 18, 19 will be another, and then all the way up to 22 at the end. So anyways, that's how it all looks. But let's go back up to our story. Abram fell face down. This is the right response. But it's also new. We don't see that in Abram's. We don't see that in Abram's actions before, and so this is pretty awesome. Abram is falling face down. So let me turn my volume down. Abram is falling face down. He's actually grown in reverence, and God said to him. So he doesn't say anything to God. He just falls face down, and God begins to continue to unpack this. Here we go. As for me, this is my covenant with you. So if you do this, I'll give you my covenant. Let me unpack the covenant. You will be the father of many nations, right? That's what we're saying over here. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be called Abraham. It's kind of a compound word. Abram is father, and there's basically a word play right here with Raham. That's not how you would say it, but it sounds like a different word, many. And so there's kind of a word play between this. And now it's many father instead of just father. For I have made you the father of many nations. Again, this will happen not through Sarai, but through his second wife, Keturah. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings, plural, will come from you. And if you're just looking at the Israelite kings, there was always kings in the north and in the south. If we think of Abram and all of his children by faith, then you can think of the many nations that have come to faith in Jesus. So this is the increased blessing to Abram. He says, I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for generations to come. What's the covenant, right? So if we're going to just follow, what is going to be the everlasting covenant, right? Here it is. To be your God and the God of your descendants after you. This is a big deal. It is a covenant of personal relationship with the descendants of Abram. Paul will say in Romans that not all who are descended of Abram are children of Abraham, but only those who are descended by faith. And this everlasting covenant to be their God and for us to be his people, this is mostly fulfilled through the church, but also fulfilled by blood through the Israelites. God's going to keep his remnant. So he continues, the whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God, right? That's the end of this first paragraph. So we have kind of this first section is number 1. This next section is 2, and then we get one more after that, and that'll be 3. We'll come to that in a little bit. But here, I will give this as an everlasting possession. Let's not forget that Israel was out of their hands for almost 2,000 years. And then it was also out of their hands for 400 years while they were in Egypt, right? So, nevertheless, God says that this land is an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God. Many people kind of thought that this could be fulfilled in the church, and then Israel was brought back as a nation. I would encourage you to read this literally, that the land of Israel will be the everlasting possession of the Israelites. And how God will make that in the new heavens and the new earth, we don't know, but that's what we have right here. So if we're going to follow that, we'll go 1 through 6 and then 7 through 8. So the covenant begins to build. Verses 3 through 6, we have Abram renamed. Names always had massive significance in the Old Testament. In these cultures, there was an idea of this, you're going to fulfill your name here. And then verses 7 through 9 is the land of Israel forever. So God builds by first asking something of Abram and then adding to the promises. Let's see how this continues to unfold. beginning in verse 9. Oh, that should be 8, sorry. Verses 7 through 8. So now the next one will begin in verse 9. Back up. All right. Then God said to Abram, and he's going to once again continue this covenant. We'll go back to green here for a second. This is the third part of the covenant. As for you, you must keep my covenant. And so God's going to make another demand here in this section. So we've got kind of demand up here. Demand down here. And then inside are the blessings. Very common to sandwich things in the Old Testament. As for you, you must keep my covenant. And again, the question you should be asking is how? We already know that he needs to be faithful and blameless. But is God going to add something else? You and your descendants after you for the generations to come. This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you, the covenant you are to keep. So we've got a double pronunciation of the covenant, right? This is very important. Every male among you shall be circumcised. That's it. Just straight up, every male shall be circumcised. This is massive for the Israelites. It's why when the Gentiles wanted to come to faith, the Israelites insisted so much, the Jews insisted so much that they be circumcised, because this was the sign. This was the way that you kept the covenant. You are to undergo circumcision, and it will be the sign of the covenant. It's the visual proof that you are part of the covenant between me and you. For the generations to come, every male among you who is 8 days old must be circumcised, including those born in your household or bought with money from a foreigner. Talking about slaves here, those who are not your offspring. Whether born in your household or bought with your money, they must be circumcised. My covenant, remember, born in your household is what he used to talk about the 318 men who he went to fight with, right? This is a word for slaves born in the household. My covenant is in your flesh is to be an everlasting covenant. The Jews are always to do this. Any uncircumcised male who has not been circumcised in the flesh will be cut off from his people, for he's broken my covenant. So this is one way to walk before God faithfully. Faithfulness means obedience, right? And how can obedience be tested? How about circumcision? And not just you, every single slave in your household. This is a huge test. So 9 through 14, we get circumcision. And it is a massive test, right? All right, let's go back up. God also said to Abram, as for your wife Sarai, so God's not done talking. Now he's going to speak to Sarai. This is the fourth section. As for your wife Sarai, you're no longer to call her Sarai, which means princess. Her name will be Sarah, which, interestingly enough, means princess. So Sarai does not undergo a name change, which is significant because she's not the mother of many nations, right? She gets a name change. There's a big deal here, but the meaning of the names does not change. I will bless her. She will surely give you a son. Like, I'm going to give you a son by her. Now we have the promised child, right? It's not Ishmael, it's somebody else. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. Again, this is fulfilled in Israel, which has 2 kings. Okay, so that's the fourth one, right? Verses 15. What was the end of that verse? Verses 15 through 16. Sarai renamed. And so through these, right? Through these, God is speaking. From 9 to 14 here, God is speaking. And what's happening is that the promise increases, but also faith is tested. That's what's happening in these verses. As the promise increases, faith is tested. And we're going to see whether or not Abram's grown over the last 13 years. Abram fell face down. So he was already down. I guess he got up at some point and fell back down again. He laughed and said to himself, and I think this is not a disrespectful laugh. It's just what he's heard is incredulous, right? It's like, I can't believe what I'm hearing. Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And immediately he switches from Sarai to Sarah, right? Just immediately jumps in with a new name. And Abram said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. And of course he would say that, right? He loves his son. But that's not the son that God promised. All right? That's not the son that God's promised. And so God's like, no. Ishmael is not the fruit of the womb that I'm promising. He's not the promised offspring that I'm giving. He is going to bless Ishmael, as we'll see in the future, but that's what Abram wishes, right? So we're kind of nearing the pinnacle of the action here. Verse 17. What about Ishmael? It's kind of what happens there, right? And here's God's answer in verse 19. Yes. But, and the yes is here for the will a son be born, right? But your wife Sarah will bear you a son. God just doubles down on what he told him up here. And you will call him Isaac, which we all know means laughter, right? And first Abram laughs, next Sarah will laugh. And God says, I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him, right? This is talking about the descendants of Israel. But God has other designs for Ishmael. So he's not done. I have heard you, and I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers. So just like Israel has 12 sons, Jacob has 12 sons, so too Ishmael has 12 sons. I will make him into a great nation. And by the way, the Arabs trace their lineage back to Ishmael, right here. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac. God will bless them, but that doesn't mean he's making a covenant with them. The covenant is with the sons of Israel, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year. 1 year from now, you're going to have your boy Isaac. When God had finished speaking with Abram, God went up from him. And that was it. That's the last thing that God is going to say, right? So what happens is right here, God. This is verses 19 through 22. And it's God doubles down on the promise. It's not going to be Ishmael, it's going to be Isaac. And then now we have reached the pinnacle question. What is Abram going to do? What will Abram's response be? This is the pinnacle of the action, at least in my book, for how this all works out. So verses 23 through 27. And so you could go here and really just make the whole thing one unit here for the peak to the bottom. So verses 23 through 27. What happens? On that very day, Abram took his son Ishmael, right? And all those born in the household, which by the way means that like the covenant here is with the 13-year-old boy Ishmael, and all those born in his household, like Eliezer, the one who he thought was going to inherit everything, and his 318 men, or those bought with his money, right? All of his slaves, every male in his household, and circumcise them as God had told him. By the way, let's ask the question, when? When did this happen? How long would it take you to bust out the knife if God said, circumcise yourselves? On that very day. The 13 years have led to greater, not lesser faith. Greater faith in Abram. Abram was 99 years old when he was circumcised. I cannot imagine what it would be like to get circumcised at 99. But Abram knows exactly what that's like. His son Ishmael was 13. Abram and his son Ishmael were both circumcised on that very day. This is twice repeated, it's a big deal. And every male in Abram's household, including those born in the household, are brought forward was circumcised with them. So here is the fruit, obedience, which just reinforces the lesson for us that faith works. Meaning faith produces works, right? God is laying out these lessons for us even now. In fact, so if we're looking kind of at Abram's life, chapter 15, he's justified by faith. Chapter 17 is the test of circumcision. And then chapter 2 is the test of sacrificing Isaac. These are bookends in terms of tests of faith, right? And it's not because God needs to know that Abram's faith is real. It's so that we know what real faith looks like. Anyone can claim to have faith, but not everybody would circumcise themselves. And we need to know that so that, not so that we can so much test others, but so that we can ask our own hearts the question, do I really believe this? And there's an elder at our church, Nolan Porter, who loves to say, slow obedience is no obedience, right? And Abram proves that his faith is real. He obeys on that very day. And that's what we learn here in Genesis chapter 17 of Abram. You can stop now if you want. Just as an aside, I want to talk real quickly about circumcision and baptism. So there's a school of thought that says circumcision is replaced by baptism. And this school of thought believes that that Israel is replaced by the church. It's really common among our Presbyterian brothers. So if Israel replaced the church, Israel was this people group. They were in a covenant relationship with God. The sign of the covenant was circumcision. They would say the church has replaced that. We are the new covenant people of God. And instead of circumcision, now we have baptism. And so they baptize their babies to say, not that they're saved, but that they're part of the covenant people of God. In the same way that the circumcision didn't save the baby in the Old Testament, it just meant that they were part of Israel. They're part of the covenant people. All right, this is a Presbyterian model of the church and baptism. So then there's kind of a more Baptist understanding of things, which is where our church is at. And that is that Israel is not replaced by the church. The church is actually grafted into Israel. So there's like this idea of a tree, right? Oh my gosh, I'm a terrible artist. And the church is added into the tree, right? We're grafted into the tree. This is the church. That's the view there. So because, and that comes from the book of Romans. Circumcision for Israel was the outward sign that they were the people of God. But God in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy 30 in particular, will say that the heart needed to be circumcised. That until the heart was circumcised, the people wouldn't really be the people of God. And that one day God would bring in a new covenant wherein he would circumcise the heart. And so in the church, we are not circumcised in the flesh, we're circumcised in the heart. So circumcision of the flesh does not correspond to baptism in the Baptist view. Circumcision of the flesh corresponds to God's circumcision of our hearts and removing the heart of stone and replacing it with the heart of flesh. The outward sign of our faith is not circumcision, it's love. It is by love that we will be known as believers. So where does baptism fit into all this? Baptism, if it is seen primarily as some outward sign of faith, at that point, it would at least have to be believers' baptism. But baptism is not primarily an expression of faith. Baptism primarily is identification with Christ's death and resurrection. Baptism for us is saying that I am born again, that I am made new, that I am a new creation, that I have died with Christ and I now have life. And so it's not this simple outward sign that replaces circumcision. It's not that. It is supposed to be the identification with the death, I am dead, and the resurrection, I am alive in Christ Jesus. Circumcision is a foreshadow, the substance of which, found in the church and in the new covenant, is circumcision of the heart, and the outward manifestation is not something in the flesh, but something that we do every day, which is love. Jesus says this very clearly: you will be known by your love. So anyways, that is the difference between Baptists and Presbyterians on this issue of circumcision and baptism. And it's important, and this text is super important for understanding that. So I just want to include that in this video for those who are interested. Have a great day, guys. God bless.